それではお二人目の講師をご紹介いたします。ロバート・ヘリア、ウェイクフォレスト大学准教授。ご専門は近世近代の日本の歴史でございます。2001年スタンフォード大学より博士号を取得され、東京大学アレゲニーカレッジでの勤務、そしてハーバード大学ライシャワー日本研究所のポスドクを経まして、2005年より現職に就いておられます。ヘリア先生も2013年から14年にかけて私どもの研究所でフェローをされておりました。主な著書に江戸時代日本における外交について論じた Defining Engagement Japan and Global Context 1640-1868 などがございます。それではヘリア先生よろしくお願いします。
Thank you. Well, thank you for the introduction, and also thanks to the Ishibashi Foundation, to the Sainsbury Institute, to University East Anglia, also to everyone here at Kyushu, the staff that's made this possible, also the interpreters in the back. Thank you for your help, and thanks to all of you for coming today. It's a real pleasure to be here to offer another contribution of thinking about tea and its story in a more international, well, similarly international context, as that Morgan outlined earlier, just a few minutes ago. If I could here, just see a second. So, in talking about tea, as with many cultures, there is many times a sense to put into national boxes. And I think here, with one of the first slides, as we think about with Japanese tea, we have here green tea and put into that national box. And with green tea, we have here in this image of Sencha, beautifully created into the spindles that defines in many ways Sencha, and also the rich green color. As was mentioned earlier, being the quintessential aspect we can think about of Japanese culture today. And by contrast, when we think about Americans in tea, first of all, perhaps the understanding, and yes, Americans today do drink more coffee than they do tea, but when we think about Americans consuming tea, it's usually considered that Americans like black tea. And the images here, for example, we have here of a sort of idealistic American barbecue here on the outside with the steaks on the grill, and iced black tea being served and consumed. Also then Americans having black tea with a tea bag, and this black tea with milk and sugar in it. Well, as with any stereotypes, these types of categories make a lot of sense. For example, Americans do today continue to consume mainly black tea, and most of that as iced tea. But what I'd like to outline for you today is that is a relatively new story in American history, that Americans have only been black tea drinkers really since the 1920s. And before that, Americans were overwhelmingly consumers of green tea, including Japanese green tea for about 50 years from the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So in a sense here, a larger point I want to make is to think about how we should complicate those national boxes of cultures of tea that we often consider. And some of the things I'd like to talk about then today is, first of all, how Americans turn to green tea, why they then in turn moved to black teas, and also how that in interesting ways influenced the course of important events in Japanese history in the 19th century, as well as in some ways how Japanese consume tea today. And here are some of my larger points that I'd like to outline here today, as I've just mentioned. This taste that Americans had for green tea, and want to emphasize here how that was sencha that was consumed, and particular then how the export of green tea to the United States influenced the development of this formation of the Japanese nation state following the Meiji Restoration. And then finally, as I mentioned a minute ago, thinking about how then that we have here an American shift to black tea was influenced Japanese consumption of sencha in the middle of the 20th century. So to talk about my first point here, and to consider why we can have tea talked about, and Japanese green tea talked about an export good following the Meiji Restoration. And before the Meiji Restoration, of course, in 1859, due to treaties signed with Western nations, Japan establishes treaty ports of Nagasaki, Yokohama, and Hakodate, and begins to more fully trade with the Western world. And with this trade, Japan is importing more products and needs to develop export goods to balance payments, to balance the trade. And tea then becomes an important good in this overall process. Now, as a line here, it shows then tea is well behind the largest product exported, and that is silk, but it's also fairly well ahead in the middle of, say, these three products of coal. And these three products form the main export goods of Japan throughout much of the Meiji period. And so one of the points I'd like to make here, how that creation of export trade played an important role, not in the economic point, although that is important of thinking about Japan's push to industrialization, but today I'd really like to outline then of how the tea trade eased political and socioeconomic tensions following the Meiji Restoration. And to think about those tensions here, I'd like to outline and emphasize just how contentious the 1860s was with the various battles that were taking place here. As I put on the chart, that we have here then the battles within domains. Here we have it in the Kyushu region, within Tosa, within Satsuma, also within Choshu, also within Tsushima. Elites, samurai battling one another, tensions there. We have battles with Western nations taking place, of course, here in this region around Fukuoka. 3 different engagements that develop. And then also battles between domains and between the Bakufu, notably, for example, the Bakufu's expeditions against Choshu in 1864 and 1867. And then finally, the battles of the Boshin War. Hard-fought battles that we can see here then moving up, and then finally, the last battle at Hakodate in early 1869. So we have then Japan is a very divided state when the Meiji Restoration is accomplished, and then following when the Meiji government asserts its overall dominance in its victory in the Boshin War. And I'd like to talk about here is what happened then to those who fought against the Tokugawa, against the new Meiji regime. Well, many ended up in Shizuoka. Many ended up there, and the stories about how we can think of the term, and I think it fits, of refugees who in 1868 and 1869 leave Edo and go to Shizuoka following their lord. Many of these are the Tokugawa vassals following their lord Yoshinobu to Tokugawa. And we have accounts of how packed the city of Shizuoka, the castle town of Simpu, is with these refugees, and only limited opportunities for employment. So therefore, many look to, as described here, of samurai returning to the soil, returning to farming, and many become then tea farmers in this region. And what I'd like to highlight then is some of, well, just before I go on to talk about those individuals, is the fact that Japan's tea export trade, because it was developing so dramatically here in the first part of the Meiji period, allowed then these opportunities to take place. In other words, allowed then for these ex-samurai to become tea farmers. Because of the demand from the United States, which I'm going to outline in more detail, you could be able to sell as a farmer tea at a higher price than other staples such as rice in this early Meiji period. So it became then a very good option for recasting and developing a new life. And so to emphasize here, the area around this Makinohara, this area of Shizuoka that was not farmed much in the Edo period. It's chosen and developed as a production area. And I'll talk a bit more about the samurai who settled there in a moment. And this is an image then of the tea field a bit later. But one of the things that is remarkable about the Japanese case is that we have here tea production on small farm model. And the fact here that a family could start anew, for example, a samurai family, on a tea farm. And that production, I'll explain a bit more in a moment about how they're selling their tea. But this is different from what is going on in tea production in other parts of the world this time here. A few decades later, when we have production in India and Ceylon, is all on large plantations. This is not the case in Japan. So an important distinction of what is going on in this period with the overall development of tea production. Now also here we do have these ex-samurai that are moving into Makinohara. They are given some financial support by the Tokugawa family and then also by Shizuoka Prefecture so they can start these new lives as tea farmers. Well, to talk about some of the groups here that are involved in this and to emphasize how many of the opponents of the Meiji regime or the former opponents of the Meiji regime who become tea farmers, for example, the Shogitai. If we can talk about then as one of the most vigorous opponents of the new Meiji regime, it was the Shogitai and their battle that they staged in the Battle of Ueno in 1868, of which the Shogitai lost, and many of the remnants of the Shogitai moved to Shizuoka and became tea farmers. Also, later in life, becoming a tea farmer is this man, Imai Nobuo. Imai was, you could describe as an ardent, perhaps the most ardent of opponents of the Meiji regime. He fought in every major battle of the Boshin War. He surrendered at the very last in Hakodate in 1869. He was arrested. He spent roughly 5 years in prison in Shizuoka and was released and allowed, remarkably then, to be able to become an official, a low-ranking official in the Shizuoka prefectural government, and later on retired, semi-retirement, as a tea farmer in Shizuoka in the area near Makinohara. His life, in his past life, came out around 1900 in a magazine, Exposés, when it was flashed across the press here that Imai was the man who killed the hero, I think we can say today, is most popular hero of the Meiji Restoration, Sakamoto Ryoma. Because Imai had been a part of one of the police forces in Kyoto that had gone to arrest Sakamoto Ryoma in 1867 and ended up killing him. With Imai, though he is not interned, he is allowed to remain the rest of his life as a tea farmer. So here is tea importantly playing a role in, as a product, to emphasize here, in national reconciliation. The remarkable fact that a divided Japan could come together as a unified state, and that there would be ideas then that you need to help these former opponents. This did not happen at the end of the American Civil War, for example, when the Confederate soldiers were told simply to go home and start anew, and were given no aid from the victorious northern side. So I want to emphasize here, I think, the remarkable aspects here of how we can think about tea and the role of the creation of the Japanese nation state. Also, too, other groups that had lost their roles, economic place in the Edo state, were given opportunities anew as tea farmers. And this included then the men, the guilds here that we have from the Hiroshige print, who transported people across the Oi River, which the Bakufu had demanded that there be no bridge across to protect Edo from a potential threat. Here we have then Bunmei Kaika, we have the idea of building bridges, creating then more infrastructure. These men are put out of work. Therefore, they are given, I said, by the creation of this bridge, for example, many of them then do become tea farmers, given opportunity then in the new state. So emphasizing again here this whole process and the role of tea as a product in national reconciliation. Well, I'd like to turn now then to a bit more, another stage, if you will, in the commodity chain of the tea export trade, and to talk about then how we have the tea is exported and some of the more people involved in that. Here again, how the opportunities that are made available by the creation of this trade. And highlighting, for example, the man here, Otani Kahe. Otani was started out as a broker, a man that was buying tea from these small farms and selling it to the Western export firms in the treaty ports, which controlled the refining of the tea and also the export of the tea. So he was one, or a representative of one group that found opportunities from the trade, as is then all of the men who found opportunities in building the tea chests, for example, in the port of Yokohama. And then also the woodblock print artists who would be creating ukiyo-e in the Edo period. As we have here then more of newspapers developed as a medium of exchanging news and information. Many of these ukiyo-e artists find work in creating the tea labels that are put on these tea chests. And I'll show you some of those labels in a moment. Otani, just to finish off with him, becomes a very important figure, the head of the Tea Export Association, and then also he is head of the Japanese exhibits at the 1904 St. Louis Exposition. I'd like to turn now then to an intriguing part then of another stage of the tea trade. So we have it, the small farmers selling it to the brokers selling it to the large Western export firms in Yokohama. And so, for example, these are images from Yokohama of where the tea was as a process called fired. This is because in the early Meiji period, the tea needed to be fired again to remove remaining moisture to prevent mold from growing during the export process before it was placed into the chests. Now, the processes that are developed were two processes here. We see the basket firing and also then the pan firing, as it was called. And the tea was stirred for upwards to 30 to 40 minutes. And working in these plants were, for example, in the case of Yokohama, women from surrounding agricultural villages who would come each day very early in the morning and would go to the different tea export firms and ask what the daily wage was going to be. And if they didn't like the daily wage, they might go to the next factory and see if they could get a better wage. This was not easy work, to say the least. It was very hot in these factories, and the tea firing was mainly during the summer. But compared to other employment of the export trade or notable Meiji industry at the time, for example, the silk reeling plants and others, the stories of women who worked there in isolated factories with many times harsher conditions. In many respects, this was again, I don't want to make to glorify it, but a better opportunity. So, with the firing process, when the tea had been put in a pan or a basket for upwards of 30 to 40 minutes, at the end it would often be white or gray. Not a tea that Americans wanted. As I'll get to in a moment, as I already mentioned, Americans wanted their tea green. So therefore, we have here then one of the most important people in the factory here, the supervisor, who at a certain moment would come around and add the important touch to the tea, a dash of Prussian blue, a pigment that allowed the tea to have a much greener color to it. And intriguingly, we had here mainly Chinese experts that were involved in this process. And this is related to the fact that when the tea export trade began, the Western merchants involved in it and the Japanese working in it, they knew a bit about tea, but not how to export it on a large scale. So therefore, the role of the Chinese experts was instrumental, if we say fundamental, to the overall trade. So this is an image that we have here then from 1900 of one of the tea export firms, and you can see then by the clothing, also by the hairstyles, that it's safe to conclude that most of these men of the skilled staff are Chinese, even as late as 1900. So here then is one of the other points that I'd like to make that's really intriguing in thinking about then tea as a product, as this export good. When we think about one of the important banners of the Meiji period of Bunmei Kaika, civilization and enlightenment, is that we think about learning from the West. Well, in this case, in order for Japan to export to the West, it was important to learn from China. Chinese know-how was critical in the overall development of this trade. Well, to get now to, I'd like to turn to a further stage here, and the American market, something that I've mentioned previously, but to really emphasize here then how important the American market was. it was, for all intents and purposes, the only destination for Japanese green tea that was exported. Japanese producers tried to find other markets, but they had to content themselves with only exporting primarily to the United States. And these figures here then show how, or I should say this text here shows how that, for example, of the tea commercially produced, that being that not the tea that's produced for your own consumption, say on a farm or in a backyard, was exported. And here then we see the amount that is exported to the United States. And here emphasizing the fact that much of the higher quality Sencha then in this period is consumed by Americans. Many Japanese, say most Japanese at this time here, were drinking then a lower grade of bancha because of the dominance of the tea export trade. So you may be asking, well, Americans and green tea, what about the Boston Tea Party? Which is, of course, it would be neglectful for me to mention it because it is an iconic moment in American cultural and certainly political history. In December 1773, American patriots threw tea into the harbor in Boston, protesting British taxation and aspects of British rule. And this is seen by many still today, and the assumption is that this was a turning point for Americans and their consumption of tea. After this point, Americans gave up tea and patriotically turned to coffee. Well, this was not the case. Americans continued to be very ardent green tea drinkers. And actually, in the first few decades of an independent America, Americans were drinking mainly black teas, and we have, thanks to the second president of the United States, John Adams, his diary, who he told us that it was black tea, a low grade of black tea that was thrown into the harbor in December 1773. But at this time here, we have Americans, and for reasons that are not entirely clear, but there is a shift in consumption after around 1800, where green tea starts to have a much more sophisticated aura about it. And Americans begin to drink almost predominantly green tea. And so this is seen in some of the historical sources I found. For example, a newspaper here from South Carolina in 1818. Now, bear with me, I know it can be, and this didn't come through here with my slide, it's all green, my apologies for that. What I have there is 5 different varieties of tea that I outlined, and I put the green there because of the 5, 4 were types of green tea. Okay, so there was predominantly green tea available here in Charleston, which was one of the more lively ports and areas of sophistication in the American South in the early 19th century. Now, American tea consumption at this time was diverse, as it is today, but many Americans liked to drink green tea hot with milk and sugar added. Also, I've found references in the South that many Americans would, for a party, make a bowl of punch of green tea, had alcohol into it, and this would serve as a beverage for everyone at the party. So here we're starting to see then Americans making on their own type of tea culture and tea consumption patterns. Well, what happens after this in the middle of the 19th century is really quite remarkable about how much more tea is produced and consumed in the world, and particularly the two largest countries of tea consumption outside of Asia, Britain and the United States. And in this chart, then you see the growth of exports of tea into the United States and to Britain. And here emphasizing that up to this point, it is only Chinese tea. China had a monopoly on the world tea market until 1859, until Japan was the first state to challenge that monopoly. And another story about how that was lost. But up to this point, it's Chinese tea, and the American ships that were going to Canton to get Chinese tea would get green tea because it was considered more sophisticated, and so therefore they could sell it at a higher price, perpetuating then this consumption pattern. So at this time, Japan is ramping up, increasing its production of tea. It comes at a perfect moment in the sense that the American population, also with industrialization, American individual incomes are increasing dramatically. And just to give you one point about population, in 1850, the US population is at 23 million. By 1900, that's at 76 million. A lot of that's to do with immigration, but we have then more Americans and more tea drinkers. That is a great moment then for Japan to develop its tea export industry. So tea in the United States, and these labels, I'd like to take a moment to show you a bit about them. And they give us a sense here then, first of all, about how Americans were choosing teas. And I've chosen these labels because they're from different parts of the United States. This one is from New York State in the east. This one is from Cleveland in the Midwest, in the center of the United States. This one is from California. Now, to emphasize here that we have then this, in many ways, a new product that is created of Japan tea. Invariably, this term is often, as you see on the labels, Japan tea. And as you can see here, just as I was outlining, the processes of the firing was important, and I wanted to go into that because Americans chose their tea based on the firing. Pan-fired tea, or a pan-fired here, or a basket-fired tea. And in the 1870s, 1880s, we see then an increase in tea consumption and also the introduction into the American market of oolong tea from Taiwan. And what we have here is that oolong tea becomes quite fashionable on the US East Coast. And where green tea and where the real heart of Japan's export trade emerges from the 1880s is in, and is described by tea merchants at the time as being green tea country, is the American Midwest. Now, this is an area that perhaps many people would not think of as being a green tea consuming area. But it is, and this is a chart made by Japanese tea merchants in the 1920s. And I don't want to go into all the details about the numbers there. What I'd like to emphasize here, if you can see, is this lightly shaded, or more dark shaded, area of green around this. This is green tea country. This is where it is most popular. Intriguingly, this is also a lot of Northern European, Scandinavian immigrants in these areas here. But we have here then with green tea and American consumers of Japanese green tea are choosing it based on the pan firing or the basket firing. And thanks to Japanese merchants who were studying the American market, we have details, for example, about the people of the large cities in Minnesota, of Minneapolis, St. Paul. They liked their tea pan-fired. And residents of Kansas City down here, they liked basket-fired teas because they fit better with their city's harder water. So I could go give you more examples here, but tea then, for the consumers of Japanese green tea, Americans are very picky and choosing it based upon particularly the production methods at the time. Also here with this, I wanted to highlight then Chicago. Emerged at this time here, the great marketplace of the Midwest. And much of the tea then is shipped then through New York by rail to Chicago and then distributed throughout the Midwest. And described here how much then tea, this city became a center of the tea trade during this time. Well, how popular then green tea is, I'd like to give you one more example from a small town here in probably about a 2.5-hour drive from Chicago in Galva. And Galva here, as you can see an image of it, a small town on the railway, pretty much thriving here on 1900. But from their newspapers here in 1881, just as we saw in Charleston in the 1818, the earlier slide I showed, green tea dominates. We have here listed best imperial tea, young Hyson tea, and Japan tea. Also, oolong tea is available. No black tea is being consumed in this small town of Galva. I'd also like to highlight here, if you can see the price of the higher imperial tea. This was probably a Sencha, sold for 60 cents a pound. But the Japan tea new crop was probably the colored tea that I mentioned earlier. So in other words, the colored tea is, to say, the everyman's tea, the cheaper version of the sophisticated product that someone could purchase. So here again, the variations that we have here within the American market, and to emphasize then why the Japanese producers are coloring the tea. It is to meet the demands of the Americans and to create then a wide variety of teas to be sold on the U.S. market. Well, the world market for tea starts to change in the 1880s because of the success of Britain to establish plantations, first in India and then later in Ceylon. And we can see here in the chart of the incredible growth of that production over the time from the 1870s, in the case of Ceylon a bit later. But in 1860, Britons were consuming upwards of 98% Chinese tea. By the mid-1880s, that number had changed to whereas 50% of the tea consumed in Britain was Indian black tea. And that continued to grow in the 1880s and 1890s, whereby India and Ceylon tea captures the British market effectively. Well, British firms that were producing these huge amounts of tea were also looking for other markets. And in 1893, decided to try and take a stab at expanding in the US market, going to green tea country, the heart of green tea country, to Chicago, and the World's Fair that took place in Chicago in 1893. And so we have at this World's Fair an interesting version of tea culture, a creation of Ceylon tea culture. A creation because there had been no tea grown on the island or consumed on the island just a decade before. But nonetheless, it is presented then as this culture to Americans in Chicago. We have here the tea house. And the goal is to convert Americans to try and, well, to taste first black tea, but then hopefully choose it over green tea. Well, also in Chicago, we think of as a dueling tea room. A Japanese tea room, which also gets a huge amount of visitors. Here we see an image from it. But then also this is a bill that was advertising the Japanese tea house. And it described how Americans who visited there could choose from 3 different types of tea. They could choose from a Sencha, but the tea house also hoped that they would pay a bit more and try matcha. Try matcha as it was served to them in an abbreviated version of the Japanese tea ceremony. So the goal here was to try and expand American consumption beyond Sencha, beyond colored teas, into matcha. And interesting then, at Chicago and at other World's Fairs, the Japanese who are displaying the teas are trying to convince Americans to move away from adding milk and sugar by trying to say, the tea is wonderful without it. You don't need to add the milk and sugar. And they're also pushing very hard aspects of Japanese culture, such as the tea ceremony. And here, based on my research, and I'm echoing some of the research by Japanese historians, is that this proved to be a mistake. Trying then to push too hard, and I understand where the tea merchants were coming from. It must have been hard to know that you have a beautiful cup of green tea, of which people are adding a lot of milk and sugar into it. But nonetheless, this is what Americans wanted. It was a different type of green tea culture that had been created in the United States over time. And this was then one of the challenges faced by the Japanese producers. They're trying to maintain and expand the market, or should I say maintain it, against the influx of black teas from India and Ceylon. Well, after the World's Fair, the India Ceylon tea lobby began a concerted effort, a negative campaign to try and paint Japanese green tea, also Chinese green tea, as something Americans should avoid because it is dangerous, dirty, and fraudulent. And these negative campaigns took the form of, one of the things was advertisements in newspapers, major newspapers like the New York Times. And the idea that was put forth is, as I mentioned, how green tea was dirty and dangerous. The contrast that the India Ceylon lobby wanted to make was how their tea was better because it was made by machines. And also they emphasized that it was white supervised. Therefore, idea that whites were able to assure a better quality tea. We have here also in this an image that was often used, images or descriptions often used in newspapers about the dirty coolie who was preparing Japanese green tea. Descriptions would detail how the Japanese tea refining factory was hot. The workers were working bare-chested. The workers were very sweaty, and their sweat would go into the tea. The idea then that this is one of the things about how dirty the process was. And so this is then shown here of how pigs are underneath the rolling table of the Japanese and Chinese producers. So this is blatantly racist, blatantly over the top, but sadly, Americans are receptive to this negative campaign. And as this negative campaign unfolds, it's sustained into the first decade of the 20th century. And eventually, it's successful in helping to push Americans to adopt black teas, particularly black teas that are sold as major brands, in much the same way that we consume a lot of black tea today. So this is an image then from around 1920, that this is Chase and Sanborn, one of the larger tea companies at the time. And you can see here then that they're selling just an orange Pico black tea, a bland black tea. But this type of tea becomes much more prominent on American tables into the 1920s. And it is then, as I say here, an important switch to black teas in the United States, which, as we can talk about here, continues very much to this day. As I mentioned at the beginning, that black tea still dominates American consumption patterns. Well, the Japanese merchants, tea merchants, didn't take this lying down. They also attempted to stop these campaigns with their own campaigns. Oh, I should say here, before I get to that, I wanted to come back to this small town of Galva, Illinois. This is a bit hard to see. I know it's a newspaper clipping, but in Galva in 1920, no more green tea, no more oolong tea. The only thing that's available is a Beresford, a national brand, India Ceylon tea. Okay, so the change is pretty drastic and notable here in a place like Galva over the 40 years that I've given you. So to come back to, as I mentioned here, the Japanese Tea Merchant Association, what can we do? Well, they go on a advertising blitz, form their own counter campaign, and hire, for example, J. Walter Thompson, still today a very famous advertising company. And what they focus on, there had been some studies by Japanese chemists earlier in this period identifying a high amount of vitamin C in Japanese green tea. So therefore, this was then taken as a means of trying to convince Americans for health reasons to turn to, again, to Japanese green tea. So this is then one of these things here, the scientist in his coat, giving you the sense here of how we have a scientific backing for this vitamin C in green tea. Well, this campaign is not successful in the United States. But what is intriguing is that this campaign then begins to be used after this within Japan, and then also to try and sell tea within the Japanese empire that is emerging here in the 1930s. And what we have here then is, and to outline, I'll come back to this in a moment, is that we have a glut of good quality Sencha that is in Japan. Americans had previously been consuming this, but now they're not. They've turned to black tea. So there's more Sencha on the domestic market. And so Japanese firms try to move to push more Sencha consumption. Here again, I want to emphasize, not saying this is the first time Sencha is consumed, but as a concerted effort to move more Japanese to consume Sencha over Bancha, this is one of the first efforts. And it's intriguing here, as you can see this vitamin C. This is the highest, is a refined green tea, higher than things like cabbage or lemon or a variety of different things here. Even even from a fresh tea that you pick on your own. No, refined tea has more vitamin C in it. So therefore, Japanese consumers are encouraged to purchase it. So this is then the Yamashiro Sencha company in New Zealand from 1926. So this push to have more domestic consumption of sencha continues in the next decade. These are some advertisements developed by the Japan Tea Association. You can see here gifts of sencha, encouragements here. So this is then a steady campaign that takes place into the 1930s. And also, what we have here with as well, and there's a lot, I put a lot into this slide, but to come back to the vitamin C element. As I mentioned, here we have Manchuria, Manchukuo, established in 1931 as an independent state, but for all intents and purposes, a part of the Japanese Empire. And Shizuoka tea merchants, for example, look to expand sales of green tea in Manchuria. Again, what's their pitch? Vitamin C. And the idea that these people in China and Manchuria that are drinking black teas can move to green tea because it will serve as an option instead of vegetables that maybe you won't be able to get in the winter. So that is one push. There's also then a push to have green tea consumed more by soldiers at the front. Here again, the emphasis is the health benefits of the green tea. Soldiers that are out fighting long times away, only with the scantest of provisions. If they can have some green tea, it'll help them to maintain their health and also then be better contributors to the whole war effort. Also, and finally, the third example here, one of the perhaps the most interesting, is the idea of how green tea had such so much amount of vitamin C in it. So therefore, campaigns were developed to gather used tea leaves, housewife associations going door to door, to gather used tea leaves and to feed those then to imperial war horses, those fighting in the front. The idea that this would be a better type of fodder, of feed for horses because of that high amount of vitamin C. So to summarize here, we see then a very interesting connection with the American market. As I say here, just to come back to, I really would like to emphasize this, that this idea then of high in vitamin C that's first tried in Americans then becomes very widespread within the sense of how tea is understood as a product here in the 1920s and 1930s. So to wrap up and give my conclusions here, to talk about that I hope have become clear throughout my presentation, but to summarize here again, the process whereby Japan moved from this incredibly diffuse Edo polity of 260 independent domains that had fought against one another and a civil war with the Boshin War, how that became the Japan, a unified Japan within a short time. Part of that story, I think, can be told through the tea trade because of the opportunities it created for so many people, as I've outlined here, but particularly for those who had fought against the Meiji state, that the opportunities they had to be a part of the state by being involved in the tea production process. To talk about as well then that all of this would not have been possible without this intriguing American taste for green tea. The fact that Americans had since the first part of the 19th century preferred green tea, and the fact that the United States had had this population growth over the 19th century, came together to really help make Japan's tea trade possible. Also then, this shift of American tastes, the move away from green tea to black tea, the impact that had then for Japanese tea producers, the fact that they were facing a glut of tea, and what they decided to do with it to increase their sales on the domestic market of Sencha that they had previously exported, and then also to sell the Sencha less successfully to parts of the empire. So overall here, to echo many of the things that Morgan had talked about, the international context of tea and Japanese tea as a product is fundamental, I think, to understanding aspects of consumption patterns of green tea in Japan today. Well, I'd like to finish off with one slide that's about tea consumption in America today. And Morgan and I are from this, we live in the same state of North Carolina in this American South. And before I left, I went to one of my local supermarkets and took a photo of the tea that was being sold at the local supermarket, because there is a lot of iced tea consumed in the American South. And most prominently, and you can see everything's big in America in the sales of the amount. So we have here gallon jugs of sweet tea. And this is a beverage that since the 1950s has defined the American South in many ways. It is a black tea with an overwhelming amount of sugar. And then next to us we see here unsweetened tea that's sold. And then finally we have green tea. If you can see here, it's with ginseng and honey added to it. Now this is also quite popular in the American South. If you go to a convenience store, you'll find, even in a very rural area, you'll find this type of green tea being sold. Describing it as green tea is challenging because it is mainly sugar water with a flavor of green tea in it. And nonetheless, this is what Americans like. And to finish off and to come back to a point I made earlier of trying to emphasize with the tea merchants at the Chicago Exposition or other expositions, when they were trying to convince Americans to drink green tea without milk and sugar and its more purest form, its better form in a lot of ways. They are unsuccessful because we do have here a unique American type of tea culture and consumption that continues today in just this little window of the American South. So I'll wrap up with that. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to our discussion continuing in the next session. Thank you.